don't want to pay for that. Who should pay for this? That is the topic of this video. Now, the beginning of the video is going to be really fun, and at the end of the video, it's going to be a little boring, because at the end of the video, I'm going to share with you what things are customary for the seller and buyer to pay for contractually. All right, this is exciting. Let's get into it. Okay, who pays for this? You're at an open house, there's a family that comes in and they have a rug rat that's really hyper, and that little rug rat decides to spin out of control and beelines it right out to the backyard. And they failed to see the screen door and they run right through the screen door. Who pays for that? Yep, you guessed it. It's that little rug rat's parents that are responsible for paying for that. They damaged the property, therefore they're on the hook. Now, this is where it gets tricky. Let's say that same little rug rat is in the primary bathroom and there's all these little bath mats, which you all know I hate, and they're not really well secured. And the little guy walks in there and he slips on a bathroom mat and grabs like a towel rack and takes the whole thing down and, breaks a bunch of things in your bathroom. Who's responsible for paying for that? So the seller would be responsible for replacement and cleaning up that whole bathroom area. Kid you not. Who's responsible for paying for this? This is a true story. A visitor comes to an open house and the listing agent says, the seller is adamant about you putting booties on. If you don't put those booties on, then you have no right coming into this house. So the visitor puts the booties on. They go tour the house, they go upstairs, and on their way down, they slip on the shiny steps and they roll down the stairs and break their back. This is a true story. Guess who is responsible? The seller, because it was their requirement to put the booties on and created an unsafe place for the visitors to view. I hate booties. I hate them for that reason. And in my opinion, if you are adamant about those booties, just know the kind of liability that you're creating for yourself. And if you are putting your house on the market, I highly suggest you increase your liability limits on your insurance policies, especially if you're going to require booties. Typically what I do is I just take my shoes off at open houses. Usually the visitors kind of get it. You can put booties on the staircase or at the entry. And if they want to put their booties on, they can. I know I'm going to get a lot of crazy comments about this. Just understand it's risky when you decide to put those little booties out or demand them. So be careful with that. Let's pivot. New topic. Who pays for commissions in real estate? I love this topic. Gets everybody all riled up. If you are the seller, you are responsible for paying for your listing agent. You can negotiate a flat fee. You can negotiate a percentage. You can do a tiered approach. You can do whatever you want, but you got to sign an agreement stating that you as a seller are hiring this listing agent for a certain fee. It's in writing, you sign it. Nowhere on that contract does it say that the seller is required or responsible or agreeing to paying the buyer's agent any compensation. Got your attention, right? All right, don't hate me, but I'm going to be honest with you. Probably 99.9% of all the offers that come across my desk, the buyers are asking the seller to compensate them to cover their buyer's agent compensation. And I'd say 99.9% of the time, the sellers are cooperative because they want their house sold. We're in a different market. They're just like, fine, let's just figure it out. The seller can say no. They can also negotiate the compensation. So about a year ago, everything changed. So now the buyer is responsible for paying their own buyer's agent compensation. I know, before you get all excited, don't get too excited here, because I know a lot of you sellers are like, yes, I don't want to pay for that stupid buyer's agent commission. So this is what's happening. The buyer will sign an agreement with the buyer's agent, and then when an offer comes in that they present to the seller, they're requesting the seller to pay for their buyer's agent compensation. Now, the seller does not have to agree. They can negotiate that. Like just today, I actually got a fully executed contract signed. The compensation came in at 2.5%. We negotiated it down to 2%. It was a very clean offer and we were all good. So now you're able to negotiate that buyer's agent commission if you are the seller. Now, where it gets a little dicey is, let's say that buyer signs an agreement with that buyer's agent for 2.5%, just hypothetically, okay, off the sales price. And then they make an offer to the seller, and the seller goes, no, I'm only going to give you 2% compensation, or I'm only going to cover 2%. Well, guess what? That buyer is now responsible for that additional 50 basis points. Now, if the buyer's agent's nice, they can say, okay, I won't make you pay it. Or guess what? They might just say, sorry, you're on the hook for that additional 50 basis points, and the buyer has to come up with that additional money. I kid you not. That is what's really going on today. And a lot of you don't know that. So if you're a buyer, I would ask that buyer's agent, like, hey, I'm going to sign a 2.5% compensation agreement with you. But what happens if the seller is only going to cover 1% or 2%? What are you going to do about that? And just listen, see what they say. If you don't like what they say, hire another agent. Who pays for the appraisal? Okay, it's kind of a trick question. So a seller can go out and go purchase their own appraisal. I oftentimes do that for my client just to set expectations, and then it really helps with negotiations. So you can do that. However, if a buyer presents an offer and they go, hey, here's my offer, but I need to use a lender because I need a mortgage. And so in that case, the buyer has to pay for an appraisal to meet the mortgage criteria, and it's expensive. So what you sellers don't know is that buyer is not required to give you a copy, because I've had a lot of sellers say, oh, well, that appraisal was done on my property and I want to know what it came in at because I'm almost positive it's higher than what the purchase price is. It may be, but guess what? That buyer is not on the hook to provide you, the seller, a copy because it's their investment. Even if it's done on your house, they're not required to. So let's say the appraisal doesn't come in at value. Is it the seller's responsibility to drop the price to that appraised value? Absolutely not. I mean, they can just tell the buyer, hey, I'm sorry, you have a really lousy appraiser. And the buyer is going to say, listen, this is a really good appraiser, but unfortunately, I can't come up with the money. Like I have to come up with all this additional money. Can you help me out? Now, the seller does not have to agree. And what I like to say, if it is a reasonable appraisal, I'm going to tell the seller, like, hey, you're going to have this problem with anybody that's going to make an offer. And then they can say, hey, I can roll the dice, take my chances. But understand, the seller does not have to budge. They are not required to. If you are a listing agent, I highly suggest that you are there for the appraisal appointment. You should have all your comps. You should be explaining to the appraiser why the house is valued the way it is, so you don't have any hiccups. I would probably say out of, 50 transactions, I probably have one appraisal that doesn't come in. And it's usually some, appraiser that just has to, think he knows it all. Because I come prepared. I know all the stuff. I'm compelling. I'm not trying to rip anybody off, but it is my job to assist and to help the process move forward. To summarize, it's not the seller's responsibility to drop the price. Now they can, but they're not required to. Let's talk special assessments, okay? This came up recently for me. Let's say a homeowner is in an HOA and there's some special assessments that are coming in like the next few months. Now, if they're like me, I get all these HOA bills and I just file them. I don't read them. So they didn't know anything about the assessments. And so when they sold their home, they didn't write on any of the disclosures that there was an assessment coming in the near future. So they close on the property and then the buyer all of a sudden realizes, oh my gosh, I got a $5,000 assessment that the seller did not disclose to me. So who pays for that? The buyer pays for that because the buyer is provided HOA docs, meeting minutes, and they should have read those disclosures in those HOA docs inside and out. And by the way, the buyer's agent should be assisting with this as well. So they should have known. So if they come back and say, seller, you did not disclose this to me, the seller can say, hey, I spent all this money and I provided you the HOA disclosures and all the meeting minutes. You should have read it. It was disclosed to you. You just did not read it. So if you're a buyer, make sure you read all those meeting minutes, because oftentimes the seller truly does not know that there are assessments coming up or even an increase in HOA dues. Okay, it's your job to read those documents. Okay, quick intermission. At the time of recording, I'm at 97,000 subscribers. I'm so close. I just want that little plaque. I just want that plaque. So help a girl out. But once I reach that 100,000 subscriber mark, I'm going to do a drawing to celebrate. That's going to be one of the biggest accomplishments of my life. You have no idea how hard it has been. But anyway, so let me tell you about the prizes. Prize number 1 is Julia Kessel Interior Design Consult. Now, this is a value of $550, and I'm literally giving her $550 for a interior design consult for one of you lucky viewers. So make sure you put your name in the drawing. She's going to give you a 1-hour consult, and she's going to give you either a mood board or a rendering of one room. Now, the second prize is this little little guy. Oh my gosh, I just love this. I know some of you hate this, but this is so pretty. This is by Alice Lane Home Collections. I did a video on, hey, is your house outdated? It's one of my favorite videos of all time. And I did feature this little guy, and a lot of you commented and said, oh my gosh, I have to have that. So we are raffling one of these little guys off. If you don't like this, we'll give you a home tool, which, by the way, there's going to be 4 prizes, and 2 of you get to select one of the home tools on my video that I did right here on homeowners. These are the home tools that you must have. So you get to pick one of those. Put your name in the drawing right here, and please subscribe to my channel. I'm almost there. All right, thanks so much. Let's get back into it. Who pays for the termite report, or who pays for the septic tank inspection? Now, let's just be clear on one thing. It is the buyer's responsibility to do all of their investigations. And the reason why I have my sellers provide a termite report is because we get to negotiate it when that offer comes in. So we can say, hey, we got this termite report, and come to find out, we need to tent the house. And since we're negotiating and you're still in love with the house, we're going to give you a credit, or we're going to ask you to just cover it as part of the transaction, but we don't want to deal with it. So we want you to deal with it. Now, the beauty of that is the buyer now knows, okay, well, I get it. Now I know that they're disclosing that there's a termite issue or there's a septic tank issue, and we're negotiating it upfront in the deal. So I like to have my sellers provide those inspection reports before we even have an accepted offer, but they're not required to, and they don't have to pay it, and they don't have to provide it to you buyers out there, because ultimately it is the buyer's responsibility to do their own investigations and to hire their own inspectors. Now, if I'm representing the buyer and I'm looking at the termite report, the septic tank report, or any other report they give us, and it looks a little fishy, I'm going to be looking at my buyer and say, no, let's just get our own termite person in here, or our own septic tank inspection, because we really want to know what it's going to really cost. So just realize, if you're receiving any reports from the seller, you're not required to go with them, okay? I have a lot of my sellers do pre-home inspections before we put their house on the market, so we can fix things and provide a really clean house to any of our buyers. And we provide that to the buyer. They're not required to go with our home inspection. They're more than likely going to do their own home inspection, and we encourage that. But just so you know, you as the buyer are ultimately responsible for doing your own investigations, not the seller. Okay, let's say the buyer spent all this money on a home inspection, a termite inspection. Maybe they called out a geoengineer to come look at all the soils, okay? They got lots of money invested into the property, and then the seller decides they want a copy of everything, and guess what? The buyer is not required to provide that to them. The buyer is spending all this money on these reports. If they decide to share it with the seller, great. And where it becomes a problem is, let's say that buyer backs out and says, I don't want to buy your house for whatever reason. The seller will say, well, you did all these investigations and all these reports on my property. I want a copy. No, the buyer doesn't have to give the seller a copy. Nope, it's their investment. Nope, they don't have to do it. Who pays for this? I have a lot of experience on this topic. Most home sellers have these big TVs and they're hanging on the wall, and the buyer will make an offer. And in that offer, it designates whether or not that buyer wants the brackets to remain with the property or not. And if the buyer designates that they want those brackets removed, then the seller agrees and the seller takes the brackets off the wall. But here's where it gets tricky. Let's say that seller takes those brackets and just pulls the whole thing off the wall, and it's this big gaping hole. Who pays for the remedy? Really depends on how big the hole is. If it's like this big old hole in the wall, this seller has to remedy that. Patch it and texture it. It's on the seller. They're not required to paint it. Now, let's say the seller just kind of unscrewed the brackets and, neatly took the brackets off the wall, and there's like a couple screw marks in the wall. That's clearly they just removed it, and the buyer is, in this case, responsible for remedying it because it's somewhat in the same condition when they sign that fully executed contract. Okay, this next one really ruffles a lot of people's feathers, and sorry, this is the way I do things, and I'm going to recommend that you do the same because it can cause a lot of trouble, and I know because I have firsthand experience, and that is, should I take the nail holes off out of the wall and touch up the paint? If you want to be a really nice seller, you can do that, but understand if that paint and the texture doesn't match perfectly, the buyer can come after you and say, this was not in the same condition that I agreed to. So where I see this happening is, the sellers are trying to be nice. They want to touch up the holes, and either the paint has faded or the sheen's a little bit different. And now it looks worse because when the buyers come walking down the hall, they can see all these different paint touch-ups. It looks awful. So what I recommend my sellers doing is either leave the nails in or take them out, but we do not patch and we do not paint because we don't want the risk of the buyer coming back and saying, we want this whole wall repainted because you used touch-up paint and now it's going to cost me a lot of money and time to remedy it. And this was not in the same condition when I signed that fully executed contract. Just understand the buyer has every right to ask for a whole new paint job. Okay? And it would be on you because you're just trying to be nice. Doesn't pay to be nice. Kidding. Okay, new topic. Let's say a seller moves off the property and their trash cans are full, and on the side yard, there's all this debris and they leave all this junk on the property, and the buyer goes to move in and they see all this stuff everywhere. Who pays for the removal? It's going to surprise you. So what'll happen is the buyer is required to give the seller a 72-hour notice to rid the property of all their junk. And if they do not do so, this has to be 3 days and it has to be in writing. If they failed to do so, the buyer can then clean it all up, pay for people to remove it, and provide the seller with the bill. Problem is they got to go to small claims court to enforce it, and that's a whole other thing. Not fun. So what I would do if I was a buyer caught in that situation is I'd go, rattle the listing agent or their broker and threaten to sue them. Why not? They kind of want problems to go away, and usually it's not a really large bill, and usually you just get it paid for. That's just my experience. Are you liking my readers? Well, I took notes and my eyes are getting really bad. Okay, so these are traditional fees, and understand that these are not set in stone. You can always negotiate them. However, if you are presenting an offer to a seller and you start getting a little too crazy and start asking for the seller to pay for things that aren't customary, they may not accept your offer. So let's just talk about, we'll just say customary or traditional fees paid by the buyer first. So the buyer is required to pay for all their inspections. Now, they can do as many inspections as they want. However, it is the responsibility traditionally to have the buyer pay for those inspections. The buyer also pays for their own appraisal fee for their lender. It's not the seller's responsibility to pay for that. Credit report. So buyer pays for their own credit report. Title insurance. So the buyer has their own title insurance. That is their burden to pay their own title insurance. If you are in a state that has escrows, usually the buyer pays for their own escrow fees and the seller pays for their own escrow fees. If there's any recording fees, typically that's the buyer. Transfer fees or wiring funds to escrow is the buyer's responsibility. Homeowners insurance premiums is required for the first year of any mortgage. So that is the buyer's responsibility to pay for. So property taxes are paid in arrears, meaning the seller pays for them ahead of time. So oftentimes the buyer will have to credit back the seller prepaid taxes. It really depends on the closing date. It is customary for the buyer to pay for their own HOA transfer fees. These fees are to cover the new establishment of their HOA account. As mentioned in this video, it is now the buyer's responsibility to pay for their own buyer's agent compensation. So oftentimes the seller will cover it, but if they don't cover the entire amount, the burden is on the buyer to cover the additional costs of the buyer's agent compensation. And of course, you buyers out there, you still have your own closing costs. Some of these lenders pass through a lot of costs onto you. I highly suggest that you ask your lender, or if you're working with escrows, to get an estimated net sheet so you can see what all the costs are. And if you're a seller, I recommend you doing the same as well. You want to know how much all these fees do add up. I usually provide a net sheet detailing all the costs to my buyer or seller before I even show them properties or before I even put their house on the market, so the expectation is set up front. So if you're working with an agent, ask them for an estimated net sheet on whatever side of the transaction you're on. And oh, by the way, if you're looking for an agent, you all know that I have a referral network. So if you're looking for agents to interview, I do have a link right down here. I'll link it right here as well. And a lot of you are thinking about putting your house on the market in springtime. Now is the time to start interviewing those agents. You want them to be working for you before you put your house on the market. Ask them for net sheets, ask them for guidance. Really important that you establish those relationships well in advance. You don't want to hire an agent like 2 days before you plan on going on the market. Okay, sellers, it's your turn. I'm going to make this really quick. Okay, it is your job to pay for your listing agent's compensation, whether you think they did a good job or not. You're also required to pay for your own escrow fees, and the buyer typically pays for their own escrow fees. Some of you don't have escrows, so you have titles or you have attorneys. So whoever's representing you, guess what? It's your job to pay for them. Title fees, each to pay their own, meaning that the buyer has their title fees, you have your title fees. All right, sellers, are you required to automatically give termite clearance to the buyer? And the answer is no. And I'd say it's 50-50, like the transactions that I'm working on right now. 50% of the time, I'm, having my sellers do it. Sometimes we just give a credit, but it's not something that we just automatically do. And for you buyers, you might think that, oh, your lender has to have termite clearance. No, they don't. I have never had a lender say, oh, we're not going to close unless, we have termite clearance. Well, unless it's a VA or FHA loan. But anyway, for the most part. So that is, in my opinion, something that is negotiable. If the buyer writes it in the contract and sellers, you agree, you do have to perform termite clearance before you close on the property. Termite clearance means that you get a report and there's some things that are listed in the report and the seller has to fix all those things in the report. There's actually section 1 and section 2. It's too confusing for this video. Section 1 is the one that you want to focus on. Let's make it simple. Now, if the seller agrees to giving credits to the buyer for some home repairs, obviously they have to pay for that. In California, we have this document called the Natural Hazard Disclosure that is a requirement for the seller to provide to the buyer. And what that document details is how far, the airplane is or the airport and how far the dump is. And hey, you're in a liquefaction zone or hey, you're in a flood zone. So it's a disclosure pretty much talking about what the surrounding area is burdened with. If there's any outstanding HOA dues or liens, the seller has to cover that. Any type of transfer tax, it's the seller's responsibility for the most part. I should say customary for the seller to cover. Any mortgage payoff amounts, obviously the seller has to cover that. And then of course, anything that needs to be cleaned out and moved off the property, it is the seller's responsibility to do that. 3 controversial costs that I'd like to talk about right now. The first one being that home warranty. Who pays for that? Now, I will tell you that in my area, it is very customary for the seller to provide a 1-year home warranty to the buyer. Okay. They don't have to, but it is probably the cheapest insurance that any seller can make. So if the buyer moves into the property and the oven's not working, the buyer won't go after the seller and say, hey, you didn't disclose to us that the oven wasn't working. Because the seller is going to say, hey, buddy, during the inspection, it was working perfectly. And we moved off the property, it was working perfectly. So we gave you a home warranty, go fix it. Kind of like shuts everything down. But it is not a requirement. Like the buyer can ask it, but the seller doesn't necessarily have to agree. I encourage my sellers to do it, but it's negotiable. Second controversial cost is that staging. Like who pays for that? I used to upfront all my staging costs. I used to have my own staging business. I used to have my own interior design business back in the day, and I just love it. And I know it makes a big difference, but I got burned so many times because I was working with unrealistic sellers and they wouldn't understand the market correction. I shouldn't say correction, change, shift. And they said, if I don't get my price, I'm going to take my house off the market. So I do things a little bit differently. I literally will say, listen, your house needs to be staged. Here's my stager. Go pay them. Once we close on a transaction, I will credit you the full amount back. But I'm not taking it anymore because I'm wising it up. Oh my gosh. Yeah. But I will say probably 90% or more of the agents out there don't have the resources to pay for the staging up front. Sometimes I do it. Depends on the house. Depends on if I like you or not. Oh, and by the way, if you're looking for an agent in Orange County, California, you know who to hire. Audra Lambert. Give me a buzz. The third controversial cost is cleaning. Just for the record, it is the seller's responsibility to clean up their mess. But here's the problem. I've had a lot of sellers reach out to me and say, oh, my old listing agent, they paid for the cleaning and we want you to pay for it. We don't want to. And if they're adamant about it and it just becomes a thing, I'm like, I just don't need these problems. I'm not going to bring my cleaning crew in to do it. Okay. I'm going to give them the money to have them bring their cleaning crew in, because if their cleaning crew messes something up or dinks something or makes a mess or trips and falls, I'm not liable. So if you are a seller, understand, plan in advance to go hire your own cleaning crew. And if you want to beg your listing agent to pay for it, you can do that. They can say no and understand it's not their job. And if you leave that house in a complete mess, guess what? the buyer can come after you because it is not in the agreed upon condition in the contract. And by the way, what condition is that? It's the time you signed a fully executed contract. More than likely, the house was in pristine condition. And when you hand over possession, that house better be in pristine condition, or you can have a lot of problems. Oh, look at little Ozzy. Oh, I got my glasses on. Look how sweet she is. She's so cute. She says hi. She says hi. Hi, baby. She's so cute. She's a Havanese, by the way. She's my, look at, I have little pictures of her. I'm a little obsessed. And by the way, for those of you who have been following my YouTube journey, Frida, my goldfish, and Georgia are doing fantastically. I literally just cleaned their fish tank and I smell like aquarium right now. It's so gross. I'm going to go take a shower. All right. That's it for me today. Please subscribe to my channel. Don't forget to put your name in the drawing. Thank you so much for your support throughout the years. I think it's been 5 years now. So anyway, help a girl out. I want that plaque. I want to get to 100,000 subscribers. I appreciate all your loyalty. All right. Enough's enough. Let's go to bed. See you in the next video.